I guess the underlying historical part of my claim is that everyone for all of history everywhere until, and I'm being generous, 2001, agreed with my view that there's no such thing as same-sex marriage.
I actually don't think that was the best response because he's arguing from a standpoint of popularity. A lot of people believed this thing, therefore this thing is likely true. Doesn't necessarily make it true. All right, so before I give my conclusion on what I think about this conversation at the end of this video, I'm really just going to be kind of watching this and critiquing the arguments from both standpoints. And at the end, I'll give my conclusion on what I believe is true and what I believe is right.
My first claim is that there is no such thing as same-sex marriage.
So your claim, what's the underlying philosophy of your claim?
Well, I guess the underlying historical part of my claim is that everyone for all of history everywhere until, and I'm being generous, 2001, agreed with my view that there's no such thing as same-sex marriage. So it seems to me that marriage intrinsically requires sexual difference. And furthermore, I think that any claim that marriage could be redefined to include same-sex marriage would render the term marriage incomprehensible.
I actually don't think that was the best response because he's arguing from a standpoint of popularity. A lot of people believed this thing, therefore this thing is likely true. Doesn't necessarily make it true. I can understand the inference that he's making to it being intrinsic. In other words, it's an intuitive thought, so therefore it's kind of common sense and it's natural, so it's likely true. But again, arguing from a standpoint of popularity doesn't necessarily make the thing true.
You say that this is based off of natural law and how Thomas Aquinas defines natural law?
There's a good natural law argument for it, but I think it's based on more than that.
It's more than that.
Based on anthropology.
But then would you say that marriage is a set of legal rights or is it a social role?
I think marriage is an institution. I think it's the fundamental political institution. I think, getting back to classical philosophy,
Of course.
that man is fundamentally a social animal. So, I think at the bedrock of politics is the unit of the family. And, of course, intrinsic to the family is marriage.
So historically speaking, the idea of marriage is, depending upon the stance that you have on God and religion, the idea of marriage historically comes from an institution that was designated by God himself. So if you don't believe that and you are arguing from more of a humanistic standpoint, then you remove the intention behind the designer, which means if that is true and if there is no God, then marriage is ultimately nothing more than a set of legal contracts and documentation that binds two people together legally and gives them inheritance rights and things like that. If you believe in the idea of God and, the original design of marriage based on religious, viewpoint, then obviously, marriage at that point would be more than legal documents. So it just depends upon which, framework that you're coming into this conversation with.
But all of those, especially with natural law, is just an assertion without evidence to back that claim, in that we see marriage over time in various cultures has been different things.
In which cultures would you say you see same-sex marriage?
I did not say same-sex marriage particularly, but the role of it when it comes to family, when it comes to the conditions. Because would you also say that if somebody is lawfully married, especially in the eyes of the church, they cannot be divorced and then married again?
Well, I
See, that's why he's kind of going into the idea of the church, because I think he's assuming that Michael Knowles is a Christian. I actually don't really know him. I've seen him, Michael Knowles, a couple of times, and I think that he identifies as a Christian, but I'm not. I think he identifies as a Christian. But yeah, that's why this the LGBTQ representative is kind of jumping to the idea of the church's belief, because the only way that you can really support your position and make authoritative claims such as this is what marriage is if you hold to a higher standard that goes beyond human interpretation. So that's why he's getting at that. I'm curious to see what Michael Knowles says.
oppose divorce and remarriage, but I'm making a more modest claim than that. I'm just saying that at its core, marriage necessarily involves two different sexes.
But how would you prove that? Because all of natural law is just this assertion. I can just as easily say the opposite, in that marriage is a set of
Well,
legal
you
rights.
keep bringing up natural law.
So technically, he's right. How would you prove that? Again, if you're religious, as Mike Knowles seems to be, if he does not interject the idea of a creator that designed marriage with a specific intention, what this man is saying is true. you can't just make assertions like that. Or in other words, you can at least question, how do you know what you're saying is true? What makes your assertion that marriage is this thing true? And he's right to question him in that way.
Law. I'm
Yes.
actually speaking even more basically. I
Even
love
more
natural law,
basically.
but I'm speaking even
Yes.
more basically than that. It seems to me that the only way that marriage could have a meaning is if it involves different sexes.
But once again, you're defining that meaning. But marriage essentially is a set of rights conferred from two spouses when it comes to inheritance, when it comes to the rights of the children, when it comes to a number of about 1,100 federal and state
Okay,
rights.
then what you're getting
And technically speaking, again, he's right. That is what marriage is, legally speaking, from purely a human standpoint, if you remove the idea of any religious conceptions that you have about what marriage was originally designed for. Technically speaking, he actually would be right about that.
getting at is interesting and might help us move forward. How would you define marriage?
I would say marriage is a legal contract between individuals when it comes to a set of property laws, when it comes to family law, when it comes to children, and many other rights that are conferred. And we do see that those rights have been conferred to members of the same sex. And so to say that same-sex marriage does not exist is not true because we see it.
Well, you say that marriage entails rights pertaining to children. Well, two men cannot create a child.
But
Two
neither
women
can
cannot
infertile
create a child.
couples. And neither can, there are a number of couples that cannot have children.
Sure. So infertility sometimes occurs, and that's
And
unfortunate.
so does gay marriage.
So the argument of marriage is designed for procreation, again, if you are from a religious background and you believe in the idea that marriage is instituted by God, then there is an order to marriage is designed for a man and a woman for procreation to, create children in the image of God. Okay, fair enough. However, if you remove that from the equation, and if that's not established, then again, what this man is saying is true. Marriage is not defined by you having children or not. Because, in other words, two people are legally married whether they have children or not. Some people are infertile, they can't have children at all. Does that make that marriage illegitimate? Of course it doesn't. So, marriage is not necessarily true because you have children. Marriage is true because it's a legal document that two people made vows before the courts and before the altar that binds them together legally. That's what makes a marriage. At least speaking from a standpoint, if you don't believe in the idea of God or some type of supernatural authority that instituted it in the first place.
I guess.
But you're asserting that without proof. We see that it does happen in that
No,
the
it
word
doesn't.
that we mean marriage
You
and
could
the legal rights.
You could say that there's such.
He's right. It is an assertion that Michael Knowles is making assertions without giving the reason behind which he's able to make those assertions. In other words, without attaching himself to the authority by which he's able to make these truth claims reality.
Such a thing as a square ball. You could say that, but a
you're
square ball
asserting that
doesn't
it's a
really exist.
contradiction. Would you agree that people have been lawfully wedded in the eyes of the government, and those two parties are members of the same sex?
No, I'm saying
If technically speaking, yes. If marriage is nothing more than legal documents where two people make an agreement in an altar before courts, and that's all you define as marriage, then yes, technically speaking, that is what marriage is. But again, ultimately, the difference between these two styles of thought is whether you believe that marriage is something that's instituted by God Himself, or whether you believe that marriage is a man-made structure that is nothing more than the legal documentation of two individuals coming into agreement about their, rights. So that's kind of the question that you have to ask yourself when it comes down to these arguments.
that isn't possible. So laws can assert all
But you're
sorts of crazy
asserting
things.
that without
Well,
proof.
like the law could say that a black person isn't a human being, but that wouldn't be true. That wouldn't make it true.
But once again, when we get into this aristocratic
See, so what Michael Knowles is doing there is he's saying that, in other words, there's a truth beyond the government laws. And that again goes back to if you believe in the idea that there is a power beyond government laws that dictates what truth is. If you don't believe that, then government laws are the authority. Now, of course, if you believe that government laws are the authority and you don't hold to a supernatural power beyond government laws, then at that point you can just make the argument, well, governments can be wrong according to my opinion. And then the other person could say, well, I agree with them or I disagree with them. And neither party is actually right. It's just merely one person's opinion about their preference versus another person's opinion about their preference.
Aristotelian view of the world, that's an assertion. Would you agree?
You're bringing up Aristotle. I don't know. I'm not bringing up Aristotle.
Well, would you say
I like Aristotle.
that Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, in the traditional view of the magisterium of the Catholic Church, are a view that you use to base your worldview off of?
I am Catholic, but marriage actually even predates the church. So I guess my view is your definition of marriage seems to get a little muddled. You say it's a legal arrangement of family, but to say that marriage is a legal arrangement pertaining to family is circular. Of course, it's a legal arrangement pertaining to family. I'm saying, what is it? When you say it's an arrangement that pertains to children, you say, well, okay, now we're getting closer because only a man and a woman can produce a child in principle. Now, of course, some couples are infertile, but just because a human being, let's say, loses an arm doesn't mean that human beings only have one arm or might have three arms.
So it was actually interesting in the way that he approached that question. So the LGBTQ representative, he basically asked him, are your beliefs based on religious values? And Michael knows he kind of had an opportunity there to say, yes, it is, because that's the authority by which I'm able to base all of my arguments. But because he kind of just disassociated himself from that, he answered and said, well, I'm Catholic, but it predates the church. Historically speaking, yes, it predates the church because Jesus Christ is the one that instituted the church about 2,000 years ago. But marriage is something that was, from a religious standpoint, is something that was instituted by God since the beginning of time with Adam and Eve. So that's the only way that he has the authority to be able to argue from that position if he attaches it to his religious views. So I'm a little bit surprised that he kind of disassociated from that. He seems to be arguing more from a personal views without attaching it to why it is that he believes that those personal views are authoritative.
We're discussing what the component. And that necessary component doesn't come from anywhere.
No. Well, I'll give you my definition of marriage.
Absolutely.
I think marriage is a lifelong union between a man and a woman ordered toward the procreation and education of children and as a secondary matter for the mutual support of the spouses.
Okay, the question to that is, whether you agree with that or not says who? Why is anything that he said there true?
Again, when we say ordered towards, is to look at the world with these preconceived notions about things.
I'm not preconceiving anything. I'm just observing nature as it is. No, I'm just observing nature, and I'm saying that that's what marriage is.
But if we're observing nature, we see that there are same-sex couples. So if we are observing
No, I'm not saying there can't be same-sex couples. I'm just saying there can't be same-sex marriage.
Are there same-sex individuals that have entered into a legal contract that the state recognizes as a marriage?
Yes, that is correct. There are same-sex couples that the state recognizes as a marriage. But again, you have to identify what is your authority. Is it what the state recognizes, or do you have a religious standpoint, which is what God recognizes? Before you come to terms with which side you support, you really can't establish what marriage is. That's going to be the problem that they continuously run into without establishing what your authority is.
Sometimes the state gets things wrong, as I am arguing has happened in the case of same-sex marriage.
So there are couples of the same sex that have been wedded in the eyes of the state.
Since 2015, the U.S. government pretends that two men can be married to each other.
But you're basing off of that nothing. You're basing that off of nothing.
No, I'm basing it off.
Yeah, see, that's why he's going to be able to say that, because in other words, what is your reason for believing that what you're saying is true? Why are you saying that the government is wrong about that?
The Obergefell decision from the Supreme Court. They're pretending. They're acting as if two men can marry each other.
According to you?
No, according to the Supreme Court in the Obergefell decision.
But what if the Supreme Court is wrong? What if the Supreme Court decides that gay marriage is right and it is legal? How can you argue against that?
Pretend as if things exist outside of the institutions that we make.
I'm just saying the word has a...
So you see what he did there? You pretend as if things exist outside of the institutions that we make. And if Michael Knowles is Christian, which from what I've seen about him, I think he is, but I don't follow him like that. But he would have to lean on that and say, yes, I believe in an authority beyond the government authority. I believe in an authority that usurps the government authority. And that would be the only way that he'd be able to support his arguments.
Meaning, and I gave you a very clear definition of what I think it means and what statistically everyone for all of human history everywhere has thought it means. And you've given me this kind of jumbled description that keeps contradicting itself. And that's my whole point, is I think it is not possible to define marriage. I have nothing against two fellas.
According to who?
Prove me wrong.
Prove you wrong. Once again, are there couples in the U.S. that have entered into a covenant that society views as marriage?
Well, some people in society view it as marriage, but many do not.
But you aren't the ones conferring rights to society.
Right, but I don't think that the government dictates reality. I think that if the government came out and passed a law and said that human beings are people with 3 heads and 17 arms and octopus tentacles, and so we decree the U.S. government, that wouldn't make it true.
But who defines marriage?
Okay, that's a perfect place to stop, actually. So Michael knows, what he was basically alluding to there is a truth that goes beyond the government, that is above the government. And ultimately, what he's talking about is God. He should have just said that from the beginning, because a lot of this conversation, the trajectory of the conversation would have went much differently had he interjected his authority by which he stands on. So when the LGBTQ representative basically says that, says who, that's the right question to ask. You're right. Says who? Without God, marriage is nothing more than a legal set of documents that 2 people agree upon that binds them together. With God, marriage is defined by the Creator. And if the Creator says a marriage is between a man and a woman, as the scriptures say in the Bible, God created Adam, and he said it's not good for man to be alone. So he created a helper suitable for him, and that helper was Eve. So since the beginning, it was always man and a woman. And man is supposed to sacrifice his life for his wife in the same way that Christ sacrificed his life for the church. And wives, submit to your husbands in the same way that the church submits to Christ. So what is marriage according to the authority of the scripture? Marriage is an institution designed by God since the beginning of time. God made Adam and Eve. God said it's not good for man to be alone, so he created a suitor suitable for Adam to help him. And then he made woman. So since the beginning, it was man and woman. God says in Leviticus that a man shall not lie with another man in the same way that he lies with a woman. It also says in the scriptures, man is the head of his wife, just as Christ is the head of the church. And man is to sacrifice his life and love his wife in the same way that Christ loved the church. Women are supposed to submit to their husbands in the same way that the church submits to Christ. So marriage, in addition to the idea that it's meant for a man and a woman to procreate in order to produce children that can bear the image of God, in addition to that, marriage is a representation of God's love for his church. And we learn about God's love for his church by the representation of a marriage between a man and a woman. That said, this is not an attack on the LGBT community. This is just a matter of truth. The scripture says in Romans that we are without excuse because God has made himself known to us by the creation of the universe. So therefore, when we don't submit ourselves to the laws of God and what we instinctively know is right and wrong, we will face a penalty for our decisions. So for those that put their trust and their faith in Jesus Christ and accept the sacrifice that he made on the cross for us, you will be saved. So with that being said, I love making commentary videos and, giving my thoughts on these types of discussions. I have other videos I just did on another Jubilee debate with 25 Christians versus Alex O'Connor. Go check that out. And other videos as well. It helps a lot when you guys subscribe to the channel. So please, if you got anything out of this, or if you just want to hear my thoughts, if you want to go ahead and tell me where you disagree, feel free to leave a comment. I try to respond as much as I can, as quickly as I can. With that said, God bless the rest of you guys' day. Until the next.